decades, Israel seems to be getting bad rap in the news, and it's been in the news a lot. So why is that, and what can we do about it? What do we know? What can you tell us, Martin? It's all you.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess I'm partly responsible for that. Certainly for people who've been watching NBC, I've been there for so long. Look, there's many parts to the answer, many ways to answer that, but I'll stick obviously to what I know best: television news. The audience of TV news, as we know, is increasingly limited. Fewer and fewer people are watching. Most viewers are 60 years plus, yet it's still the most influential source of news. And all the big networks, they're all increasing their reach now by new, smaller platforms on social media. You know, NBC Now, NBC Ideas, NBC Twitter, Snapchat, and there's many others. So, and ABC, CBS, Fox, CNN all do the same thing. They all have a huge audience, and TV probably is still the most influential audience. So it's really important what we put on. So Israel getting a bad rep. First of all, remember two things about journalism and communication. What works in journalism? What works in telling stories? So first of all, in terms of Israel, you know, you've got to have a good story in order to tell a good story. Otherwise, it just becomes spin, and spin is usually unconvincing. So Israel has a hard time, very often, persuading the world that the occupation of the West Bank, I do call it occupation, is a good thing. And things that happen there inevitably create a bad impression. And there's many, many other aspects, obviously, to Israel. But I just want to mention that one right now. And the second thing about journalists and what stories you choose to tell is that the audience, and we too, me as well, everybody, we tend to believe things that we already feel. The more a story supports the accepted narrative, the more we believe it. So journalists tend to do stories that support the narrative. They're easier to communicate and to get people to understand. If the story goes against the narrative, it's harder to understand. So usually we often don't tell that story. I can't tell you how many times I sat in on NBC Nightly News or Today Show or the other various shows, just trying to decide what story are we going to do? What are we going to put on the air today? And very often stories that go against the accepted narrative get thrown out. People say, oh, it's too complicated. No one's going to understand what you're talking about, you know, and they don't get done. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I went down to Gaza to visit Shifa Hospital. It's the largest hospital in Gaza. I went there because there was a story that 25% of the babies in intensive care unit were dying. 25%, that's a huge number. And it was Associated Press did the story. It was picked up by news outlets all around the world. And me too. I said, hey, this is a great story. 25% of babies dying. That's crazy. We've got to do a story on that. And of course, the narrative that falls into was, why are they dying? Well, obviously, you know, the doctors are going to tell us they don't get enough medicine. The Israeli blockade means they can't get all the equipment they need. Doctors and nurses aren't getting the proper training, all because of the nasty Israelis and their blockade. So that was the story that fell within that narrative. Oh, wow, that's an easy story to tell. We'll go do that. And I also said that, in all honesty. So I went down to Shifa Hospital and I spoke to the hospital spokesman. And he said, yes, 25% of babies are dying. It's a scandal. And the United Nations, also UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, they also put out the story. They repeated the story, 25% of kids. And I said, that's crazy. Why is that? And he said, well, Israeli blockade. He said all the stuff. So I said, well, I'd like to go meet some of the parents. And he said, no, you can't do that. And I said, I'd like to go down to the ward. Let's go visit the intensive care unit. He said, no, you can't do that. So anyway, you know, being journalists, we made our way around and we went into the intensive care unit. And the babies all looked pretty good. And we spoke to the nurses and said, how come 1 in 4 babies here are dying? And the nurses said, what are you talking about? That's not true. Of course they don't. We're much, you know, we look after our babies properly. So I said, well, that's strange. Well, this whole story, the United Nations even quoted it. So I did the next thing I did as a journalist, you know, I went to the morgue. And with my Arab translator, we looked at the records of the morgue. And there was nothing like so many babies dying. They were just completely untrue. And so we took the papers from the morgue, went to the hospital spokesman and said, what's this about 25% of the babies dying? It's not true. And then when he realized that we had all the information, he said, no, that's a mistake, not 25%, 2.5%. It's a whole difference, 2.5%. So I actually called up the United Nations spokesman in Jerusalem, and I spoke to Associated Press in Tel Aviv and said, you've got to change the story. And nobody would. They wouldn't change the story. They just said, oh, it's we've moved on. And when I said to NBC, we can't do the story, but there's a great story about how they're misrepresenting the truth, they didn't want to know about it. In other words, bad news, Israel victim, Israel villain, that's a story. People, the good, actually 2.5% is in fact a very good number, as a matter of fact. So they were doing very well in Gaza, but we didn't tell that story. So those kinds of stories that go against the narrative don't get told. And when you think about Israel today, we as Jews, we care. We read carefully what's going on in the news. But most non-Jews, they couldn't care less, or maybe care a little. What do they know about Israel? Think of the country. When you ask them, not much. They don't need to think about it. Don't need Mideast oil anymore. Don't want to go there on vacation. So why should we care? So war, it's a place of war, trouble, who needs it? And of course, that's framed by what they hear and read in the news, which is mostly trouble. So that's one reason Israel gets a bad rap, because we only do stories that reflect poorly on Israel, because that fits the narrative of Israel. I've been there. I've got a long history of reporting from Israel. I spent 2 years there as a news cameraman from 72 to 74. And then I went back as the NBC News correspondent in 82 for a 3-year assignment. And I stayed until 2014. So 3 years became 28 years. I met my wife there. She's a soldier. She was hitchhiking. I picked her up. My 3 sons were born there. And I always struggled with the same thing. How do you tell stories about the real Israel when what gets you on the air mostly are stories of war and disaster? That's what constitutes the news in the West, conflict. So, people blame the media, blame the journalists. Why do you only focus on the bad stuff? It isn't the fault of journalists. It's a very important thing, I think, to understand in terms of reporting from Israel. The Western way of telling a story is based on conflict, not only in TV news, in movies, books, also, everything. Think of the classic cliche of a story. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. All the obstacles that Ulysses had to overcome before he made it back home from the Trojan Wars. It took him 10 years of overcoming obstacles. One of my favorite movies, is A Karate Kid. Boy gets bullied, learns to fight back, wins. And that's what makes a story in the Western world, conflict and the hope and satisfaction of a happy ending. So that's what got Israel on the air for decades, wars and bombs and the tantalizing hope of a resolution, peace. For instance, I'll tell you an example. War with Hezbollah got me on nightly news and the Today Show every day for 32 days the last time round. Peace with Jordan got me on the air for 1 day. And last week's agreement with the Arab Emirates, the UAE, there was one story on that on NBC. Peace is not a story. So if all you hear about Israel is when there's a bomb or a war, you think of Israel as a place of conflict. You lose interest. Enough already. The occupation of Palestinians may make you angry. Many people, especially in Europe, parts of America, extend that hostility and loss of patience to Jews in general. That's why it's dangerous. Ignorance weakens Israel, and by extension, it harms the image of Jews. Anti-Semitism is clearly on the rise again, and it's fueled by ignorance and prejudice. Now, of course, it isn't all wrong. Israel is a place of conflict. Of course it is. It's much more than that too, though. And that's the issue that I think is so important. It's so much more than a place of conflict. What I found at NBC was that to tell the stories about the real Israel, real Israelis, I had to use violence to get into the story, the real story that I wanted to tell. Stories about people. What we always say is that little story tells big story. You understand the emotions and the dilemmas of an individual. It tells you the bigger picture of the country. We focus too much in news on sort of what, where, how happened, but we don't say who did it really happen to and why did it happen. And we need to do that, not just for the Jews, but for Palestinians too. I'd like to show you a couple of stories. If Tony, if you can just get ready, I'm going to show you one story that was on nightly news. It's about an American family that made Aliyah. And this is what happened to them. And I should say right now that today I regret when I looked at the piece, I regret the last line, and I'll talk about that. But this is a story just about one family with a beautiful message in the end that I wanted to tell. And the little boy expressed it so well. So Tony, if you could just run that first story, please.
Through the biblical hills of the Judean desert, a father and son on a sad journey.
It's a family tragedy.
Tracing the last footsteps of Kobe, the son of Seth, the brother of Daniel.
He was my best friend. It's sad for the people that die, but it's even sadder for the people that I left behind.
Daniel, 12 years old, trying to come to terms with his grief. For the first time visiting the cave where his big brother Kobe and a friend were savagely killed last month. Two 14-year-olds playing hooky from school. Palestinians smashed in their heads with rocks. Brutal murders that shocked the world.
I wanted to see where Kobe was at the last seconds of his life.
Kids grow up quickly in this war-torn land. After his brother's funeral and 7 days mourning, math class is a welcome refuge. But kids can't escape the conflict for long here. Daniel lives in the West Bank settlement of Tekoa, Jews surrounded by Arab villagers. Then, only 3 days later, another brutal reminder of life on the front lines. Palestinians fired a single shot at Tekoa, and of all places, it hit Daniel's house. Right into his sister Eliana's bedroom.
I was downstairs with my friend. By ourselves.
Did you hear it?
Yeah, we saw fire and we heard a big boom.
Another shock for Daniel's parents, who moved from Maryland 5 years ago. Is this struggle for the land worth it?
Yeah, I hope so. It's paradise for children here, as long as they're not murdered by terrorists.
It's Daniel who most wants to stay. He loves his donkey, his friends, the rugged hills, and now his brother is buried nearby. Daniel can't decide whether to be a rabbi or a teacher when he grows up, but he does know his dream for the future.
We have to stop hating them, and they have to stop hating us. We need to stop hurting them, and they need to stop hurting us. And then we need to be together.
A lesson learnt the hard way by a child longing for peace, growing up in a land of hatred and war. Martin Fletcher, NBC News, Tekoa, the West Bank.
So that was a pretty, it was a very emotional story to do, and the family was a charming, lovely family. And looking at it, and what we did with that story, I think, was the boy's expression of hope and dream for peace at the end was a really important message, I thought. And I must say that today, when I was looking at a story to show you, and I saw the last line, heard the last line, growing up in the land. What was the last line? Of hatred and war, I think it was. I regret that now because it's obviously so much more, but I guess at the time, that's how it felt to me. So that's why I wrote it. But imagine now if I'd written growing up in a land of love and peace. We wouldn't have done that report. That report would never have gone on the air if the message had been that it's all a land of love and peace, because it goes against the narratives, as I mentioned before. Stories that confirm the narrative in a way are just easier for people to understand and get on the air. And that's a tragedy. I mean, we need to fight that as journalists all the time. But it's very difficult when you're just trying to compete for airtime with other journalists. And it's the same in the media, in the print media too. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that conflict gets you on the air. It's accurate, but it's also a limited view of the place. There's so many great stories to tell. I have a friend, Danny Hakim, who has a martial arts dojo. He brings together Jews, Palestinians, Lebanese, Jordanians, people from other countries, and they all have these martial arts workshops together. I did a story on that actually when he took them to the Athens Olympics, but it's hard to get those kind of stories on the air. Science, technology, even those kind of stories. The ones that get on the air, technology, it's mostly about military advances, Iron Dome, the drones, nano warfare. Peace movements, why tell them? They're limited. Why do stories on them? We should do, but it's hard to get them on the air. Even the New York Times is now a shadow of itself in terms of pages. Everybody's cut back, less reporting, violence gets you on the air. When I was preparing for this talk, I called NBC News in Tel Aviv because, as you know, I don't actually work there anymore. The last 10 reports on nightly news from Israel, 8 of them were to do with conflict and the peace moves. In other words, the conflict. There's nothing else to talk about. And the other 2, by the way, one was about Netanyahu's corruption charges. And the other one was about, if you remember, when was that, about a year ago? 2 US congresswomen were banned from entering Israel. So there's 2 more negative stories about Israel. There's no positive reporting, or very, very little, because of what I was talking about, that conflict is the issue, the way in which we tell stories. And I think it's getting worse now. The focus is becoming more narrow. News reporting in general is becoming more frenetic, with shorter stories that just say what happened today with almost no context. So, you know, this is one of the, I mean, Suzanne, you asked me, why does Israel get a bad rap? I mean, all of these things I'm talking about add up to the fact that there's limited view of reporting from Israel. And therefore, most people who depend on TV news get a limited perspective. And it's not a very nice perspective. It's, you know, it presents Israel as a dangerous place. I can't tell you how many times when I was living there, and I lived there for 30 years, people would phone me up and say, hey, is it safe to visit Israel? Of course it was. Well, it's the context and the explanation that we need to focus on. And I think, and I want to get on to what we can do about this, by the way. So this is what I want to emphasize. You need to present Israel in its full context, to explain and to humanize the people and the issues that they're facing. So I'm going to show you a second story. So Tony, you just run it in just a moment. This is a story about 2 women, an Israeli and a Palestinian, both mothers. And well, you know what? The story is actually self-explanatory. So let's just run the story, Tony, and we'll talk about it briefly afterwards.
We first met them 6 months ago, 2 mothers living with fear and anger. In Ramallah, the Palestinian 42-year-old Najwa Sadeh. How do you feel about being here? I mean, this is Arafat's under siege here. You've got the tanks over here. You're smelling the tear gas right now.
Humiliated, Martin. I feel humiliated here. I feel that I'm a prisoner in my own country.
And 10 miles away in Jerusalem, the Israeli 40-year-old Edith Shema, living in constant fear her children could be killed by a suicide bomber. And while we were with her, suddenly the news, a bomb had just exploded by the school gate. Don't leave school, stay inside, she desperately tells her children.
I'm worried when they go out. I ask them to call me every time.
2 mothers divided by their people's hate. Then finally, Edith asked why. Over the internet, she wanted to know how the Palestinians could justify killing Israeli civilians.
I got many responses. Most of them were very angry.
But then came a message from a woman in Ramallah. It was Najwa.
She made me understand better the despair.
And against the odds, Najwa and Edith became friends on the internet. For months, their concern for each other grew, softening a little the pain around them.
I'm really worried about you.
Let me know you and your children are okay.
A glimmer of hope in the toughest of times. Then the 2 women decided they wanted to meet. But there was always a bomb or a killing. So finally, NBC News offered to bring them together.
How are you? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. How are you?
I'm fine.
Yeah. You look different than I imagined.
How did you imagine me?
You look beautiful.
You too.
Are you nervous?
I was. No, I'm not anymore.
They were both filled with hope.
I think there can be peace, but peace needs a lot of time, and peace needs the world to understand.
That was 6 months ago, 2 enemies who became friends, hoping their story could become the story of their peoples. But it didn't. There would be no peace. Instead, the violence only got worse. This week, we went back to check on the 2 friends. For the last 7 weeks, Najwa's family in Ramallah has lived under an Israeli curfew. Her children are helpless as Israeli tanks patrol the streets they want to play in.
What they see is very bad, you know. They see soldiers all around us all the time that are preventing them from living a normal life.
And Edith more frightened than ever while Jerusalem is torn apart by the suicide bombers.
Hope sounds ridiculous now.
And we learnt they had stopped meeting and talking with each other. Anger had taken the place of hope.
I think we don't have much to say anymore. I'm frustrated and angry. I've been experiencing anger that I have never felt before.
I don't know what I can say to her. I do realize that life must be hell for them, but I don't think it justifies killing innocent people on buses.
Two mothers who tried to break the barriers of fear and hate. For a brief moment they had a chance of friendship, but found that although war is not the answer, neither, it seems, is friendship, at least not for now. Martin Fletcher, NBC News, Jerusalem.
So it's become fairly quiet right now on the West Bank. We don't have those kind of, that suicide bombing campaign is over, but I think that's actually the first time I've seen that story for some time. I think it's a pretty good story in terms of getting to the heart of the concerns of the two mothers and what their hopes were and how those hopes were dashed. So again, that's the kind of story that actually, you know, I can't imagine nightly news or any of the networks running that kind of a story on the evening news, especially at that length, because the whole story is actually all about context. It's not about anything that happened that day, and that's what we're missing: the time to tell stories, and we have to find ways to do that. So I think Suzanne, I think I've been dealing with the question of, okay, that's why there's such a negative image among many people about Israel. I think it's changing, to be honest. I feel it's changing slightly. But the question is, okay, so what do we do about it? What do you do to change Israel's image via the media? Well, first of all, what I did, as Suzanne mentioned, I wrote a book, Walking Israel. I specifically wrote it in my last couple of years as a correspondent at NBC, because I wanted to tell that different story. Very briefly, you know, all that reporting that we've just been looking at actually is typical of the problem. my work, as I showed you, is actually typical of the problem, which is that mostly when people look at Israel, they look at Israel from a north-south viewpoint. There's a line running from north to south, the green line, and everything to the east of that is the conflict, and like as the two stories we've just been telling, and that's the Israel people see, the Israel of conflict. But actually, there's another north-south line, the coast of Israel, and if you look eastwards from the coast of Israel, you see a completely different story, a completely different country. So that's what I did. I walked along the coast of Israel from Lebanon to Gaza, and then wrote a book about the people I met and the issues that were raised. And it's kind of like a different kind of a political book about Israel told through me walking and meeting people. And yes, it won the National Jewish Book Award. I was very pleased with that. The difference today, I think, is that, well, obviously the big difference today is that mainstream media, you know, we no longer have the monopoly we had in information. And in some ways that's a great thing, in others it's dangerous. You know, social media today is a great source of information. The problem, of course, is you don't know what's true and what's wrong, what's a lie, what's political disinformation. For instance, I'm part of a Facebook group called Secret Tel Aviv. It's not so secret, it's got loads of people, loads of members and loads of information, but it's all about the issues that people face. It's very interesting, mostly young people, mostly new immigrants. I mean, you guys probably know a lot more than I do about social media, so I won't embarrass myself, but Twitter, Instagram, those are the places where today, that's where you go for real breaking news. I mean, news cameramen today never get the first video of almost anything. It's just the nearest person with a cell phone who shares it. And then that video then gets picked up by NBC and the rest and shared on YouTube and TikTok and I don't know where. It's, you know, it's more dramatic, it's more immediate, it's more real. It doesn't have any context. You've got no idea what happened before or afterwards. You're just seeing a dramatic moment, and that influences your views about what's going on. And the context never gets explained later either, because by the time you've shown this dramatic piece of video on the screen, maybe a policeman beating somebody or whatever it is, Israeli soldier kicking somebody in the head, by the time you've shown that and you say, hey, what's that all about? You've already moved on to the next subject. Weather, war, street fighting, traffic accidents, demonstrations, you know, it's just frenetic quality of information today that makes it very difficult to tell any context. So here's me saying we need more context, but actually it's the communications world we live in today is even less context. So that's a major issue. And I think that the answer about what to do is more input from people like you guys, and me for that matter. I mean, I personally distrust everything I see and hear until I've asked questions and I got some answers. I Google everything to find out what's really happening when I'm being told something about what's happening, especially to do with Israel. But most people, of course, don't do that. They don't care. They don't check. They accept information as probably true. Why not? You know, but you just don't know what's real on social media. And of course, with the digitalization of changing people's faces, I mean, it's going to get a lot worse. It's going to get a lot harder to tell the real story of anywhere, and include, especially, as a matter of fact, Israel, for those of us who care about it. So what I think the answer now, I'd like to wind down here. I think I've spoken enough. I'd love to leave some time for questions. I think the answer is to flood social media with positive stories. You're not going to get those positive stories on the mainstream media, what we now call the networks and the New York Times, etc. But we're all journalists. We can all put stuff on the social media. I'm not saying go and report stories. You hear something, tell the story. Include a photograph, a bit of video, and just tell the story in 5 sentences. Just point out to people who couldn't care less about Israel that actually, hey, here's this great tennis player. There's an Israeli medical team helping in a Turkish earthquake, or I don't know, fingers crossed, here's the first effective coronavirus vaccine. You know, get on post your stories that tell a good story, and they get repeated so much. I think that's the way forward in terms of changing people's minds, especially young people who live pretty much on social media.
Martin, I have a couple questions that have come through, and then we'll go to some other ones too, if you want to start with that. Okay, so we got a question from Robert Cohn. I believe entirety in his sincerity regarding these stories in sync or not in sync with the narrative, but adds that something journalists we should fight against. Do you ever, in fact, fight against some of the stories and win with NBC and, you know, getting these stories up?
I actually, although I left NBC in 2014, I still run writing classes for correspondents and producers there, storytelling classes. So I am involved with these people all the time, a lot of the time. But mostly you lose arguments. And one of the reasons for that is that if you're in the field and you have an argument with people in New York, they're all together in the room talking about you and you're not there. It's very hard to win those kind of arguments. And there's another example, for instance, from Gaza. You remember, well, I guess it was in 2014 when I was there the last time. During the fighting there was a lot of rockets. You know, Hamas was firing from schools, from schoolyards, from in narrow alleys between buildings. And we did a story on that. And then NBC News wouldn't run it. They said, we don't believe that's true. And there was this whole argument about it. And let me go back a second. I wasn't in Gaza at that point. I was reporting from inside Israel. And I was saying we need to do this story about the way Hamas is using civilians as cover. And they said, no, the NBC people in Gaza are saying that's not true. But it obviously is true, was true. And then after the fighting, journalists from all around the world were saying, yes, it was true, but we were afraid to report that. So then I had this whole thing about the ethics and the morals of war reporting. And they basically said, look, we'll endanger the lives of our NBC people in Gaza if we say what's happening. So I said, well, if we can't say what's happening, then we shouldn't have them in Gaza. We should bring them out. But of course, I lost that argument. The narrative is Hamas fighting back, and that was an example of the truth being withheld. Definitely.
So this question goes with that one. Are stories mostly edited or producer direct, or does a reporter have an equal say on what they're reporting or what makes it on air? How much say did you have into?
We have total. Well, I had total control over what I did and what I said. Total control, but I didn't have any control over what they decided to put on the air, because in the end, there's the producers in New York putting together a show, a nightly news story program, which is 30 minutes long, only 22 minutes of stories because the rest is all advertising, and they've got to decide what goes in those 22 minutes. And so they may well say, hey, that's a great story, Fletcher, but we haven't got room tonight. And that happens often. But in terms of what we say in the stories, nobody in my entire career ever said to me, you have to say this or that. Never happened. did happen under Peter Jennings at ABC, I should add, at the time.
Wow. Okay, this came in from Stuart Turgel. I had dinner with Dory Gold in a private home in Jerusalem a dozen years ago. He asked me why Israel always seems to be losing the PR war. His reply was because Israel cares less about its image than the diaspora Jews care about how Israel is viewed internationally. What do you think about that?
I think that's one of those cliche responses that aren't true. I mean, Israelis care very much about their image. And I mean, I think you all know that every time you visit Israel, I mean, people are always saying, so what do you think of Israel? You know, what are they saying about us? I think Israelis care very much. But they care about different things, I would say. I mean, they care about their I think when Jews in the diaspora, or in America or Britain, look at Israel, they're talking about often war and peace and those kinds of issues. In Israel, they're talking about different issues. They're talking about jobs, education, the conflict between the religious and secular. Those are their daily issues. Daily issues are not those sort of issues about survival. So I think that's an important point to make. They have different concerns.
So Martin, if you could report on any story that's out there now, what story would you like to tell and why?
Well, that's a great question. I tell you what, people are always saying to me whenever something happens, you know, oh wow, don't you wish you were there? And I know I really don't wish I was there. Been there, done that. I would like to tell good stories about Israel. I would love to go back to Israel now and tell some positive stories. By the way, after I left NBC 2014, I started working for PBS NewsHour weekend edition, and I did about 10 stories. None of them were about the conflict. They were all about the growth of the exploitation of natural gas, and I can't even remember now. But they're all sort of decent stories, you know, that reflected well on the country. And I want to emphasize, I don't want to only do good stories on Israel. I want Israel to solve its problems, and you have to report on all the bad stuff too, but not only the bad stuff.
Okay,
I didn't really answer your question.
Yeah, it's always curious to say and how about a story that happened since you've left that you would have liked to have a piece of?
Well, I always wanted to cover the Paris fashion show, but they never sent me. And I think I'd still like to do that kind of, you know, really sort of rubbishy, you know, that's the kind of story I would love to write funny stories about. I started writing fiction, as you know, and so that's taken me in an entirely different direction. I thought fiction would be great because instead of doing all that research you've got to do for nonfiction, like breaking news and walking Israel, or as a journalist, you just make it up, no problem. But actually, it turns out to be much harder to write fiction.
Well, we're going to keep going, but I just want to remind everybody that Martin and I are going to be in conversation about his fiction book, Promised Land, on September 14th, and there's information on the Limmud North America site if you want to join us for that conversation. Great book. If you still have time to read it before that, you don't have to read it to come join us, but it's really worth the read. I'm going to open it up. Tony, do you want to let anybody want to ask specific questions and have their hand up? You want to unmute some people? I see a couple of hands.
All right, sure. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I will try to get to you. I'm going to unmute you and then you should be able to say something. So I'll call on Lonnie to start off because I see your hand first.
Hey, so Martin, you visited us in New Orleans at the JCC a couple of years ago with your book, A Promised Land, which I really, really enjoyed. So the first question, 2 parts. First question is, when's the sequel coming out? Because you promised us there would be a 2 and a 3. And the second one is, can you share, you shared with us your wonderful idea on the 2-state solution, which I have been quoting ever since. And I want you to share it in your own words with us today, because it's fantastic. Thank you.
Hi, Lonnie. First of all, everybody says, when's the next book coming out? I haven't written it yet. It was supposed. I mean, Promised Land is was supposed to be the first in a trilogy. Like each about a family, and each book would cover about 20 years. I think I probably said to you, my idea was like sort of Israeli soap opera, but you know, like Dallas meets Exodus. That was kind of my idea. Well, I'm afraid I haven't written it. Well, and I can only apologize because everybody always says to me, so what happened to Peter? Who got the girl? You know, that kind of stuff. And that's for my idea for a two-state solution. I've got to say, this is embarrassing. I'm not too sure what you're referring to. Well, give me a hint.
Tony, can you?
So I will repeat it. Somebody asked the question, what do you think about a two-state solution? He goes, I've got the answer. It's like we should put all the extremists into one state and everybody else gets to live in the other one. Fantastic.
But yeah. You know what? That's kind of like a sort of a flip line, but it's actually pretty true. And it does grow out of what I really think, which is that people always, I think they wrongly define the Israeli-Arab issue. You know, it's always like the Israelis versus the Arabs. And I don't think it is Israelis versus the Arabs. There's plenty of Israelis who want to make peace. And there's plenty of Israelis who want to keep everything and not compromise. And there's plenty of Arabs the same. There's plenty of Arabs who'd make peace tomorrow if there was a possibility. And there's plenty of Arabs who extremists who just want to keep fighting till the end. So that's exactly what I think. You know, it's not a definition of Arabs versus Jews. I think the definition is people who want to compromise versus people who don't want to compromise. That's what I think the issue is. So yeah, you know, give them Uganda. I'm not sure which group gets Uganda, but that's.
So I got an interesting question that came in. Is it possible to report on Israel without interjecting a political element? Tough question.
I think that's what I did, to be honest with you. I mean, I was sent there for 3 years as an NBC News correspondent, and I stayed there for 28 years in the same job. And that's like totally unheard of because people always say, oh, after 5 years, they get too much into the story. But the fact was both sides accepted me as somebody who told their story fairly and honestly, you know. So I think it is possible to be apolitical in it. You know, there's plenty of examples of correspondents who are Jews whose sons are in the army. I mean, my son was in the army. That makes it very difficult, I suppose, to think objectively about what's going on. If you remember during that suicide bombing campaign, you know, like everybody else in Israel, I would send my kids off to school and hope they came back in one piece because they went on school buses and cafes and discos, you know. And then in the afternoon, or rather after I sent them off to school, I go to the West Bank and talk to the people who are making the bombs. So, you know, it is possible to be fair. I mean, I don't use the word apolitical. I don't use the word objective. I think the goal of the correspondent has to be simply to be fair to everybody he talks to and tell their story fairly. Objectively, no one's objective, you know, but I mean, you've got to be fair to everybody. That's what I try to do.
I think that question is a nice lead into one that Howard Wiseman had. Howard, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you so that you can ask that yourself. And if folks could share their video when they're asking questions so that we can see you as well as hear you. So Howard, I've unmuted you and you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you. I'm really appreciating this. I spend a fair amount of time in Israel, not this year, but usually once a year. I have a couple of brothers living there. And from afar, when I get back here, there aren't that many sources that have a positive take on Israeli news, international stories. And I wanted to ask you about honest reporting. And my curiosity is, are they regarded as a serious news organization? Are they so pro-Israel that they are not taken as seriously?
Well, I think among journalists.
Is that a fair question, by the way? I'm sorry, if I don't mean to put you on the spot about that.
No.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm curious. I need some insight because I think they're good, but I also think, go ahead, anyway.
Yeah. No. No, it's a good question. I think it's an important question because, you know, if an organization is pro-Israel and they're trying to trip people up, well, not trip people up, but trying to get to the basics, get to the sources and find out, you know, hold people accountable, put it that way. The fact they're pro-Israel will immediately make them suspect. And I felt that when I was there, I mean, they did plenty of stuff about what, they made plenty of comments about my work among everybody else's. And I thought they were fair. Most people do not think they're fair. But again, it's because of the narrative. The narrative is, oh, if you're a pro-Israeli monitoring organization, then you've got to be pro-Israel. You're not going to be fair. I found them to be very fair, as a matter of fact. And a couple of times I engaged them and I answered their questions. And I can't think of examples right now, but once or twice I said to them, I'm going to take that into account and change what I did, and I did. You know, because I feel if somebody is right, they're right, and if I'm wrong, I've been wrong plenty of times. You know, but not all journalists would be as flexible as me. On the other hand, I felt I owed it to Israel because my wife's Israeli, my kids are Israeli. But my wife holds me accountable. But to answer your question, basically, honestreporting.com, I think is a good. They do good work, but they're not widely respected among journalists because they tell that narrative that journalists don't want to hear.
So I have a question that came in, which I think is an excellent question. Your work explores the ethics of journalism with younger journalists who have grown up with the internet, Twitter, et cetera. Do you feel there's a big difference between prior generations and journalists now with all the social media?
Well, you know, I'm as you can imagine, I'm on an ex-NBC, Facebook page, and I'm also on their CBS Facebook page. And it's almost all us old guys whining about how it's not done, how poor the reporting is today, you know. So, no, but it is different, no doubt about it. And as I said before, I actually run a working, I help train NBC correspondents and producers, people who are already working, and we're just trying to get them to the next level. And I think it's remarkable how, well, first of all, it's not only the journalist's fault. I mean, individually, obviously, they're just as smart as we were. They may be more ambitious than we were. There's nothing to do with who they are as individuals or even their education. The real limiting factor today is that media has become so fragmented and everybody's in competition for what they call eyeballs, that the content, you know, we're suddenly talking about eyeballs and content and platforms instead of just saying we need a good story. So the emphasis is all wrong, I think, today. The average story, I keep giving NBC examples only because that's what I know best, but it's definitely the same with everybody. The average NBC nightly news story today, the length of it is about 1 minute and 10 seconds. You do reports today, 45, 55 seconds. When I was doing it, it was like more like 2 minutes, 2 minutes 15. So yeah, they haven't got the context. We didn't have enough context. They have less context, but it's not the fault of the journalist. It's the fault of the whole media landscape in which everybody's expected to be fast. And if you make a mistake, well, don't worry, we'll correct it tomorrow, which they rarely do, by the way. I think the key point I would say now is that whereas in the past, it was all about, first of all, accuracy, then speed, and then style. Those are the three requisites of the UPI used to talk about: speed, accuracy, style. But accuracy first. Today, it's speed first. Because if you're 5 seconds after CNN or it's been on Twitter, no one's listening to you. They're all listening to whatever the first thing that came up. We all get these news flashes on the telephone. Well, how many times are those news flashes wrong? Quite often. But the damage is done. So I think that it's more a criticism of the world we live in, which we can't really change very much, than the journalists themselves. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. Tony, there's some hands up, so if you want to call on the next one.
So I see that Joanne and Arnold Jacobson have a question, so we'll call on them, and then we'll close out with Arlene, and then...
Hi, Joanne. Hi, Arnold.
So I've unmuted you, Joanne and Arnold, and just go ahead and accept that.
Yes, I think one of the major problems that very few people talk about, although the majority of Arabs and Palestinians may want peace, but you have a significant, maybe 10% who are Islamists who sort of control the media, and the imams are typically Islamists, and they believe that Islam and politics go together, and that the only way of the only way for Islam to thrive is through Sharia law. And I think until there's a reformation, you're not going to have really true peace between Islam and the West. It may take 100 years or 200 years or maybe never.
What do you think?
I think that, well, first of all, Joanne and Arnold, hi, how are you? It's lovely to, I mean, I wasn't listening, I missed the first part of what you were saying, because I kept thinking about the lovely times you were hosting me. So, Islam in the West. Look, you know, we're on different, we're on different wavelengths entirely. I think this idea that, you know, we have to look for a way to make peace between Islam and the West ain't never going to happen. You know, we're on different wavelengths. The way I mentioned at the beginning about how we tell stories, which I think is very important in the West, based on conflict. You know, nevertheless, what we do in the West, and I'm talking about Islam in the West, is that when we try to work out what happened, sometimes there's a bombing or whatever, we look at the facts and we try to come to some kind of conclusion. That's, you know, we're based at what we may call the rule of law. That's how we think. I don't say Muslims, but well, I guess so. I mean, the Islamic world, it's not even Islam, it's the Arabic world. They don't treat facts in the same way as we do. It's more important for them to have an accepted communal narrative that they accept. And so while we're trying to find the truth, they're trying to find something that makes them feel better as a group. And I'm not the first person to say that. I'm actually rather poorly paraphrasing Karen Armstrong, who's a wonderful writer. She was a Jesuit who became a writer and has published wonderful books about Islam and all kinds and religions, and Jewish religion, including Jewish religion. And she made that point, what she called mythos and logos. We in the West function according to what the facts, and Islam functions according to myths. So we're always like that. We're never going to meet like this. It's not going to happen. We're always going to be like that. And having said that, the progress that Israel's making with the United Arab Emirates right now is encouraging, but it's got nothing to do with Islam. So so Arnold, I think that the answer to that question is only that it's a false premise to think that our goal is to bring Arabs and the West together. We just think differently as a group. That may sound racist, but I believe that's true. And if it is racist, I blame Karen Armstrong.
All right, so we're at our time, but I'm gonna go ahead and unmute Arlene, who has a question. And Arlene, you should be able to click the button and unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay, so there is a media that portrays Israel's side, and it's a disreputable media, Breitbart. If you're familiar with Breitbart, they're very right-wing extremist, and they have a news presence in Israel. And I'm wondering what your opinion is of reporters that are working in Israel for Breitbart. That's my question.
I can't answer it properly because I don't know any of them personally, and I don't follow their reporting, and I would be highly suspicious of anything. I mean, Breitbart is just it began as a totally factional extremist organization, and that's part of the problem that I was mentioning before about social media. You don't know what's right and you don't know what's wrong. I mean, they have a very loud megaphone. Steve Bannon was a brilliant megaphone loudspeaker for them. You know, I began right at the very beginning by saying, if you're not telling the truth, it's just become spin. If you don't have a good story, you can't tell a good story, just spin. I mean, Breitbart's spin on almost every subject, to me, is laughable. You know, it's very important to me. I enjoy reading those kind of organizations just to find out what people are saying. But you really need to check everything, you know. So Breitbart, to me, lost all credibility a long time ago.